My name is Liam. I'm 30 years old, and if you had asked me yesterday what the most ordinary part of my life was, I would have said the bus ride to work. Every weekday morning, I board at the same stop, sit near the window, and let the motion of the vehicle carry me through a half-waking haze as the city scrolls past. It's never been special, just routine, mechanical, unremarkable. That morning, though, something shifted. The bus was almost empty when I stepped inside. Only a few passengers dotted the seats up front. I chose my usual spot, halfway down beside the window. Outside, the city still yawned awake. The glass of shop fronts reflected the pale, muted sun, and the air carried that chill that comes just before spring properly settles. I leaned my head against the cool glass and tried to let my thoughts drift. Then the doors opened again with their familiar hiss. A man climbed on. He looked close to my age, maybe 30 as well. What struck me wasn't his appearance, though he had an easy, unforced kind of confidence about him, but the way he didn't hesitate. He didn't glance left or right at the many empty rows, didn't pause to decide where to sit. From the moment his shoes touched the bus floor, his eyes had found me. He walked straight down the aisle. Each step felt deliberate, like he already knew where he belonged. And then, without asking, without hesitation, he dropped into the seat beside me. The bus was nearly empty, yet here he was, so close that I could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint trace of coffee on his breath. He turned, smiled, and said almost playfully, "Hey, mind some company." It wasn't what he said, it was the way he said it. The voice had a strange familiarity, like a melody I couldn't quite place but had definitely heard before. It stirred something in me, a faint recognition that made no sense. Normally, I avoid conversation during these rides. I value the silence, the separation. But instead of brushing him off, I found myself nodding. And in that moment, so small, so seemingly meaningless, I set in motion a day that would unravel my certainty about everything I thought was real. He told me his name was Mark. Just like that, casual, unguarded, as if we had been acquaintances for years. His voice carried a kind of brightness that filled the air between us. It was disarming. Within minutes, he had me laughing. Not the polite laugh you give a stranger who tries too hard, but the real, sudden bursts you can't fake. He seemed to have a talent for it, pulling stories from thin air, weaving them with just the right detail to make them land. He told me about a dog he once saw on the subway, wearing sunglasses, about a man who fell asleep at a crosswalk and woke up convinced he'd time-traveled. It was silly, but I found myself grinning. What struck me more than his humor was his ease. He didn't feel like someone new I was meeting. It felt like reconnecting with someone I'd once known very well, though I couldn't place from where. At one point during a lull in conversation, he leaned closer and said, almost conspiratorially, "You know, Liam, you look like you could use a break. Why are you even heading to work today? Honestly, look outside. Sun's out, sky's clear. Days like this are rare. What if you just skipped it? Let's walk the city. Just forget the schedule for once." His words were outrageous. I wasn't the type to ditch work for no reason. I had deadlines, emails, a boss who barely tolerated lateness. Yet, as the bus rumbled beneath us and I caught the glint in his eye, I realized how long it had been since I'd done anything reckless. Skip work? I repeated, testing the thought. It felt foreign in my mouth. Exactly. Call a day off. No one ever remembers another day at the office, but they remember when something unexpected happens. He tilted his head, smiling like he already knew my answer. And the strangest part? He was right. The thought of dragging myself into the fluorescent glow of my office, clicking through another set of meaningless tasks, suddenly felt unbearable. The contrast between that monotony and the presence of this strange, energetic man beside me made my decision before I even realized it. I took a breath. Okay, let's do it. The words tasted reckless, almost electric. The bus jolted to a stop. Mark stood, already moving toward the door, his confidence absolute. He didn't even check to see if I'd follow. He simply knew I would. And without thinking, I did. That was the moment my carefully constructed routine fractured. I didn't realize then how deeply that small act of surrender would entangle me in something I still don't fully understand. We stepped off the bus together, the city morning stretching wide around us. The streets buzzed faintly with commuters, but there was something surreal about the decision I had just made. I was supposed to be walking toward my office building, clocking in like every other weekday. Instead, I was following a stranger, Mark, toward a part of town I rarely explored. We ended up at a small cafe on a corner, one of those places with fogged-up windows and chalkboard menus scribbled in half-legible handwriting. The bell above the door jingled softly as we entered. The air inside was warm, saturated with the rich scent of roasted coffee beans and baked bread. I reached for my wallet, ready to order, but Mark stopped me with a light tap on my arm. "For you, as always, coffee with milk," he told the barista with an effortless confidence. I froze. My lips parted, but no words came out. It was such a small thing, and yet it struck me like a punch. He hadn't asked, hadn't guessed timidly. He had said it as if he'd ordered for me 100 times before. The barista nodded, unfazed, as though nothing unusual had happened. 2 steaming cups arrived moments later, and we settled by the window. I couldn't let it go. "How did you know that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged, sipping his coffee. His eyes glittered with something unreadable. "Lucky guess," he said, but it didn't feel like a guess. It felt like a fact. We talked for hours, though time seemed to dissolve in that cafe. Conversation flowed with strange ease. It wasn't shallow small talk. We spoke about music, about the way the city looked different, depending on which bus line you took, about the quiet sadness of people who never look up from their phones. He asked me questions no one had asked before, what I dreamed of when I was a child, what I thought of when I couldn't sleep at night. And all the while, I had this gnawing sense of déjà vu. The way he laughed, the way his hand curled around the cup, the way he tilted his head when listening, it all carried the texture of memory. After the cafe, we drifted through the park. Spring was just beginning to show itself in pale blossoms, the air damp and fresh. We sat by the riverbank, tossing crumbs of bread to ducks, watching ripples fan out across the water. For the first time in years, I felt light. No weight of deadlines, no suffocating routine. Just the simple, childlike pleasure of existing in the moment with someone who made me feel as if I had known him forever. And yet, beneath that warmth, something colder lingered, an unease I couldn't name. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't how you meet someone for the first time. This was how you remember them. The day unfolded as if it had been scripted, though not by me. Mark led the way through streets I thought I knew. Yet somehow, with him, they felt different, alive, brighter, almost dreamlike. It was as though the world bent slightly around his presence, making ordinary places shimmer with unfamiliar significance. We bought sandwiches from a food cart and sat on a bench in a quiet square. People passed by, their conversations a blur, and for a while I forgot that I was technically playing hooky from work. But the more time we spent together, the more little oddities began to surface. At one point, I asked almost offhandedly, "So what do you do for work?" Mark paused, mid-bite, as if I'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. Then he gave a small, practiced smile. "Oh, nowhere right now. Just decided to stay here a little longer." "Stay where?" I pressed. "In the city?" He looked at me, and for a second his eyes were sharper, more focused than before. Then, just as quickly, he broke into a laugh and changed the subject. It unsettled me. The way he dodged the question wasn't casual. It was intentional, almost protective. Later, as we walked, he mentioned things that stopped me in my tracks. "You know," he said, pointing toward an empty stretch of pavement, "that's just like the street where you used to ride your bike as a kid. Remember? You'd race down that hill so fast you almost broke your arm." I froze. "How do you know that?" He shrugged, his grin playful. "You told me, but I hadn't. Not today, not ever. That memory belonged to me alone." And then, as if to drive the nail deeper, he added, "Didn't your friend Daniel live near there? The one with the red sneakers?" Daniel. A name I hadn't spoken in years, not since childhood. Someone who had been important once, then vanished into the fog of time. I laughed awkwardly, trying to shake off the unease. "I must have mentioned it earlier," I said, though I knew I hadn't. He didn't correct me. He just let the silence linger for a beat too long before cracking another joke, steering me away from the thought. But as the sun dipped lower, painting the city in gold, I couldn't ignore the gnawing question. Who exactly was Mark? The hours bled into each other until the day felt like a single breath I had been holding too long. We drifted from streets to parks, from coffee to idle conversations about nothing, and somehow it all felt significant, like fragments of a dream I didn't want to wake from. By the time the sun began to sink, the sky over the city shifted into a bruised palette of orange and purple. The streets glowed in that strange, tender light that makes everything look softer than it really is. We found ourselves back near the bus stop where it had all begun. The air had cooled, carrying with it the faint smell of exhaust and evening meals wafting from apartment windows. I stood there, reluctant, not wanting the day to collapse into memory. Mark stretched his arms, sighed contentedly, then looked at me with a kind of warmth that felt almost paternal, almost brotherly, something familiar but impossible to define. "Well," he said, patting me lightly on the shoulder, "thank for today. It was really good." "Good," I echoed, half laughing. It was more than good. Honestly, I don't remember the last time I felt like this. He smiled at that, but it wasn't his usual carefree grin. This one carried a weight, a sadness tucked in the corners of his mouth. I hesitated, then asked, "So, will I see you again?" For a moment, silence hung between us, heavy and fragile. He tilted his head, eyes fixed on the approaching bus. Then he said softly, "Maybe." Just that. One word, stretched with possibility and finality all at once. The bus screeched to a halt. The doors opened with a familiar hiss, and people filed inside. Mark turned to me, gave the smallest wave, and with that same gentle smile, he stepped onto the bus. I watched him move down the aisle, watched his figure blur among the others. But when I blinked, he was gone. I don't mean gone in the sense that I lost sight of him. I mean gone. 1 second he was there, and in the next, it was as though the crowd had swallowed him whole. No trace, no glimpse, no farewell glance. The doors closed. The bus rumbled away, and I stood alone at the stop, the echo of his presence already fading into the night. That was the last time I thought I would see him. But I was wrong. Morning returned like nothing had happened. My alarm buzzed at the same time. The same dull gray light seeped through my curtains, and the same rhythm of routine carried me toward the bus stop. Yet something inside me buzzed with expectation. I told myself it was foolish. I had spent one spontaneous day with a stranger, nothing more. But still, I caught myself scanning the street, waiting. The bus pulled up, brakes screeching. The same driver nodded at me, an older man with a weary face, one I'd seen countless times. I climbed aboard, searching instinctively for that familiar presence. But the seat beside mine was empty. I hesitated, then decided to test something. As I handed over my fare, I said lightly, "Yesterday, you picked up a guy sitting next to me, Mark. You must have seen him. We rode together the whole day." The driver's expression tightened, his brow knitting as if I had spoken nonsense. "What are you talking about? You were alone yesterday. The bus was nearly empty. Just you." I blinked, forcing a laugh. "Come on, he was right there. Dark hair, easy smile, kept me company all morning. You didn't notice?" The driver shook his head firmly. "I notice. I've been doing this long enough to remember faces. You rode alone. No one sat with you." His tone wasn't dismissive. It was sharp, almost defensive, as if I had accused him of something. A chill crawled up my spine. I muttered a thanks and walked down the aisle, heart hammering harder with each step. I slid into my usual spot by the window. The empty cushion beside me felt heavier than if someone had actually been there. The bus rattled forward, and I tried to convince myself the driver had simply forgotten or hadn't been paying attention. But then I looked down. Resting on the seat beside me was a slip of paper, folded once, edges slightly damp from the condensation of a coffee cup. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was a receipt. The logo of the cafe from yesterday stared back at me. 2 items were listed. Coffee with milk, too. The world tilted just slightly. The driver might not have seen him, but the receipt did. And suddenly, I wasn't sure which possibility terrified me more, that Mark had been real or that he hadn't. The receipt sat in my palm like a fragment of evidence, the only tangible proof that yesterday had not been a delusion. I folded it carefully, almost reverently, and slipped it into my pocket as though it were precious. Maybe I needed it to remind myself that Mark existed, or at least that I hadn't simply dreamed him into being. Work that day felt unbearable. My coworkers' voices were muffled, their conversations meaningless. Numbers on the screen blurred until they were unreadable. All I could think about was Mark, his laughter, his uncanny familiarity, the way he had vanished into the crowd. By the time the clock struck 5, I had made up my mind. I retraced the steps of our day. The cafe was my first stop. The bell jingled as I entered, and for a second, I expected to see him already sitting by the window, smiling as if nothing strange had happened. But the table was empty. I approached the counter. The barista, a young woman with tired eyes, looked up at me. "Hi," I began awkwardly. "Yesterday, I was here with a friend. Do you remember us?" She frowned slightly, thinking, "When yesterday?" "Morning, around 9. 2 coffees with milk." Her brow smoothed. "I remember you," she said slowly. "But you were alone. You ordered 2 drinks, though. I even thought it was a bit odd. You drank one and left the other untouched." The floor seemed to shift under my feet. "No," I insisted. "I wasn't alone. He was right here, dark hair, about my age, talked a lot. His name was Mark." The barista gave me a sympathetic look, the kind you give someone who's confused but not dangerous. "I only saw you." I wanted to argue, but the lump in my throat stopped me. Instead, I thanked her quietly and stepped back onto the street. The city felt hostile now, every face in the crowd a stranger, every corner hiding something I couldn't see. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the receipt laid out in front of me. My apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I stared at those words, "coffee with milk, too," until they blurred. Somewhere between exhaustion and dread, a thought surfaced, unwelcome and cold. What if no one else could see him? And worse, what if he wasn't a stranger at all, but someone I was supposed to remember? Sleep was a stranger that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, half lit by sunlight in the cafe, smiling at me like he knew more than I did. I tossed and turned until dawn bled pale light across my walls. By the next morning, I was unraveling. I skipped the bus entirely and walked through the city streets, hoping the rhythm of footsteps on pavement would ground me. But everywhere I went, I felt his presence, not literally, but like an echo, a shadow behind glass. Passing by the park where we had sat by the river, I could almost hear his voice beside me. "Remember when you were 10, and you fell in trying to grab that stupid paper boat? You cried for hours until your dad carried you home." I stopped dead in my tracks. My chest tightened. That had happened. I hadn't told anyone in decades. I hadn't even remembered it clearly until that moment. I hurried home, slamming the door behind me like the city itself had become unsafe. My apartment was quiet, sterile, but I felt no relief. I went to the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to force myself into clarity. When I finally looked up, I caught my reflection in the mirror, pale skin, tired eyes, stubble growing in patches. And for a split second, just a flicker, it wasn't me staring back. It was Mark. The features were subtle but undeniable. The curve of his smile, the way his eyes glinted with that same knowing warmth, it was him. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Just my own exhausted face remained, pale and shaking. I stumbled backward, heart hammering so hard I thought my chest would burst. I didn't know what was real anymore. Pulling myself together, I reached for the drawer where I kept old photographs. Childhood birthdays, school trips, family outings. I sifted through them with trembling hands. And then, in one of the photos half blurred in the background, I saw him. Mark, standing beside me at age 12, though I had no memory of him ever being there. The edges of the photo trembled in my grip. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was whisper his name. Who was Mark? I couldn't look away from the photograph. My 12-year-old self stood awkwardly in the foreground, a forced smile plastered across my face. But there, just over my shoulder, was Mark, unchanged. Same hair, same build, same easy grin. He looked exactly as he did yesterday. The photo was dated 15 years ago. My hand shook so badly I nearly tore it in half. This wasn't possible. Faces change, people age, but Mark hadn't. He was frozen, untouched by time. I dug deeper into the stack, pulling out photos at random. Birthday parties, school trips, family barbecues. Again and again, he appeared. Not always in the center, sometimes blurred in the background, sometimes just far enough away that you'd miss him if you weren't looking closely. But once I knew, I couldn't unsee him. He was there, always there. My stomach twisted into knots. I didn't remember him. I should have. A person that constant in my life, someone always near. There's no way memory could erase him entirely. Unless it wasn't memory doing the erasing. By the time night fell, I was pacing my apartment like a trapped animal. Every corner felt dangerous, every shadow too deep. I tried calling my mother, hoping she'd offer clarity, but when I asked, "Do you remember anyone named Mark from my childhood?" she grew quiet. After a long pause, she answered, "No, Liam. I don't. Should I?" Her tone was flat, almost rehearsed, as if she was holding something back. When I pushed, she cut the conversation short. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. The silence of the apartment pressed against my ears. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. 3 taps, slow, deliberate at my door. I froze. My heart stuttered in my chest. I crept closer, each step heavy, the room thick with dread. I placed my hand on the knob, hesitated, and whispered through the wood. "Mark?" No answer, just silence. When I finally pulled the door open, the hallway stretched out empty, lit by the sickly yellow glow of a flickering bulb. But on the floor, just at the threshold, lay something small. A bus ticket, dated yesterday. 1 seat, my seat, and written across the back in neat handwriting. "See you tomorrow." I stood frozen, staring at the bus ticket on the floor. The words seemed to burn into my eyes. "See you tomorrow." My fingers trembled as I picked it up, as if holding it would make it real, or maybe make it disappear. But I didn't throw it away. Somehow I knew that I couldn't. The apartment felt impossibly large, every shadow stretching, twisting. I turned toward the window and looked out at the city streets. People moved along their routines, oblivious, perfectly ordinary, and yet I couldn't feel any part of it. My pulse hammered, and every small noise in the room made me jump. And then I saw him. Not through the window, not on the street, but in my peripheral vision, just for a flicker of a second. A dark figure leaning against the wall, smiling that same familiar, impossible smile. My stomach dropped. I spun, but the corner was empty. The shadows were nothing. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, but my instinct screamed louder. He was real. Somehow, he had always been real. And somehow, he had been everywhere I had been. I collapsed onto the couch, wrapping my arms around my knees. I tried to breathe, tried to think, tried to remember. But memory failed me, slipping like water through my fingers. Every photograph, every whispered memory, every laugh, and every casual word he had said, all of it blurred together. I realized then that I had lost the boundary between what was real and what was not. Mark wasn't just a stranger, wasn't just a memory, wasn't just yesterday. He was something else, something persistent, something that had woven itself into my life so seamlessly that I couldn't tell where he ended and I began. The night dragged on. Every creak in the floor, every distant sound of the city made my nerves fray further. And yet, there was a strange calm beneath the terror, a strange relief. I wasn't alone in the way I had thought I was. Someone or something had always been there, waiting, patient, watching. As I finally closed my eyes, exhausted, I knew I would see him again tomorrow. I didn't know if it would be in the bus, the street, or in the mirror. But I knew this. The world had changed. Reality had changed. And I would never, ever be able to go back to the life I had before that ordinary morning. Mark was no longer just a part of the day. He was part of me. And maybe that was the most terrifying and most undeniable truth of all.